Everybody doing today?
We're ready for reading week.
Right.
They have a midterm.
Everybody needs next week, I think, at this point. Eh?
Yeah.
What midterms be there? Do you have one tonight? Or yeah?
I don't, but yeah, there's one. Calc 4.
Calc? Oh,
Oh, it's math.
oof. Yeah. Okay. Well, good luck with it, I guess. So, might as well get started then.
No.
So, continuing our series of things that it would be useful to know for labs, we're going to talk about real-time clocks today. Last time in class, of course, we finished off the material on the I2c communication protocol. We got a little bit into shift registers, which are a generally useful thing to know about. I'm getting more and more strongly the impression that registers themselves maybe at no point were actually covered in sufficient detail to actually understand their functionality. Is that true? Did you guys cover registers?
Not before this course.
Not for this course, but in the all of you were supposed to take EngPhys 2 EO4 or something like that towards the lab component, right?
No registers.
That one is literally we got up to sequential logic design with flip-flops, but none of it was loading things into registers.
Oh, okay. Well, it's actually not too far off. A register really is just an array of flip-flops. So, okay, so we're not as bad as I thought we were. Okay. So anyway, so we're going to talk about real-time clocks today. I'd like to motivate this with a brief history lesson on Nintendo games, which is going to be relevant to the current discussion. Don't worry. But how many here have played a Pokemon game? How many of what? Okay, what was your first Pokemon game? Anybody in the crowd?
Emerald.
Emerald.
Diamond.
Diamond. Diamond. Anyone else? Okay. You guys are getting to be, I'm getting to be pretty old. So, the first one I played was Red, right? Because, I was 12 when it came out or something like that. So, the first Pokemon game, right, it was just a game. The thing that made that game really interesting and what made it really explode was actually the utilization of serial communication protocols to allow communication between Game Boys and cartridges. So, the Game Boy, the original Game Boy, had a communication port on the side of it, which was intended to be used for serial communication, but it was kind of underutilized. You saw some games that had you could hook up 2 packs of Tetris and play Tetris against each other, but it was kind of serial communication protocols in combination with really, truly excellent game design that really brought the game to life. It's definitely one of the reasons that those things became the phenomenon that they were. So, in the early days of the Pokemon franchise, pretty much every new game that they came out with had some kind of hardware integration that was, to some degree, either rarely used or kind of unique in some way. At any rate, it popularized a lot of the sort of hardware things that we all take for granted these days. So one of the features that was introduced in Pokemon Gold and Silver version, the original ones, was a real-time clock. So you have to imagine, these days people think of a game as data, right? But back in the day when it was a cartridge-based system, you actually had the ability to put ICs onto the cartridge itself. You saw some interesting, one of the interesting examples of that is Castlevania 3, the NES cartridge, had an expanded music chip on it that was reasonably expensive and drove up the price of the game a little bit, but I won't play it now, but if you actually listen to the difference between the North American and the Japanese version of the soundtracks for those two games, it's very stark, the contrast. But anyway, so one of the things that they added to the Pokemon games was real-time clock functionality. What that allowed is it allowed them to, for example, tell the difference between day and night on inside of the game world. It also allowed you to have different game options for particular days of the week. There was a cave where you could only catch Lapras on Mondays, stuff like that. So the real-time clock became an integral part of the Pokemon games until the Game Boy itself began to have real-time clock functionality, which didn't actually happen until the DS. So the Game Boy Advance actually didn't have a real-time clock functionality. Any games that used real-time clocks for the GBA had an internal IC that was providing that functionality. So what is a real-time clock then? You can probably sort of gather what it is by this point. But it's an IC that keeps track of quote-unquote real time. This is different from the timers that we've been talking about up to now in class. A timer, it just counts with a certain frequency. It doesn't have any real correlation to what day of the week it is, for example, unless you do a lot of work to put that in, right? That's up to you as the designer. The real-time clock IC, on the other hand, actually tells you what the hour, minute, second, day of the week, maybe day of the week, but it keeps track of actual real time, as you might guess from the name. So yeah, any questions about that so far? Cool. So we're going to look at how it is that these things keep track of time, the mechanisms by which time is kept, and we're going to see how the real-time clock encodes dates for you, because it does it in a specific way that you're going to have to then deal with at some point. You guys haven't done binary coded decimal yet, right?
We did in the last course.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, because we had to display our student number on like a 7-segment display, so we learned that.
Oh, cool. All right. All right, cool. Well, maybe we'll go over it quickly again then. So, the real-time clock. So the real-time clock is a digital clock that provides calendar, date, and time. Generally speaking, when you have a real-time clock, you want it to consume as little power as is humanly possible, right? That is because these things are typically powered by a separate battery source than the rest of the circuit. What this allows is it allows the real-time clock to preserve its date and time through power cycling of the main circuit. So, if you cast your brain back into, perhaps some of you who played Pokemon Emerald or, the older Pokemon games, they have this thing now where if you have an old Pokemon cartridge, the date-time functionality no longer works on it. You can actually pay people to replace the batteries in it. That's like I guess, at the time, they had no concept that people would still be interested in playing that game 20 years later. So, the batteries have run out on all of the cartridges, and yet, people still want to play the game. So you can pay to have the battery replaced. But But yeah, it's got a separate battery source. That separate battery source will eventually run dry, right? At which point it has to be replaced, right? Because it's not like it's a rechargeable battery source or anything. So, so yeah, generally it's either a battery or a supercapacitor. But, you know, at any rate, it stores its own power. The real-time clock has higher accuracy requirements than even the clock line that is being used to drive your CPU. As we're going to see, the CPU, the clock that drives the CPU actually skips a certain number of oscillations with a certain probability, just because, you know, it's a physical object and it's not a perfect, they're not perfect. Generally speaking, like, clock slippage isn't a huge deal for the processor because it just like takes a break for like the missing clock cycle, right? However, if what you're trying to keep track of is the actual time in real time, if you have an oscillator crystal that is skipping too many oscillations, say per million oscillations, what that looks like is clock drift. Like, who here has a digital watch? Just a couple of people, eh? So, digital watches operate on the same quartz crystal frequency oscillation type scheme. Basically, what a digital wristwatch is it's one of these guys that's hooked up to a display, and that's what you got, right? So, do your digital watches keep time perfectly? They don't, right? How much do they lose? How often do you have to reset your watch?
I mean, I've never had to reset.
No? How long have you had the watch?
Not long.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Like, I have an alarm clock. It's like a digital alarm clock, and like every so often it gets like 10 minutes off.
Yeah, yeah. Frequency probably every couple of months?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as we're going to see, these, depending on the crystal that you get, and you know, the frequency of the crystal actually plays a large part in this. You can lose maybe a couple of seconds a day on a typical real-time clock, right? So those couple of like when you have the clock slipping, it's not a big deal for the CPU because it's not keeping track of time, but you lose time over time, if that makes sense. If you're trying to if you're assuming that every oscillation corresponds to a certain fraction of a second. So, this is essentially why you have to reset your digital alarm clocks every once in a while. It's because the oscillation in the crystal actually doesn't occur with some frequency because of physical laws. Now, obviously, you can get much more accurate clocks. The way that most internet-connected devices do it these days is they simply look up the current time as published by probably the International Standards Organization or some people like that. Like you can get atomic clocks which have which don't have as much oscillation slippage and are very, very, very precise. But of course, it would be ridiculous to put an atomic clock inside of your wristwatch, right? I'm not sure if it would be radioactive. I'm not sure if atomic clocks are radioactive. Probably not. It's probably like the number of oscillations of a helium atom or something. But anyway, so yeah, that's the sort of thing that we have to contend with when we are trying to integrate real-time functionality into our embedded systems. So, okay, before we move on, let's just talk applications brief second. So we know wristwatches and digital alarm clocks are applications of real-time clocks, also Pokemon games. Who can tell, who has an idea of what it might be useful to put a real-time clock in? Anybody got any ideas about applications? Yes?
A GPS?
A GPS. Yes, GPSs have to, they have to know time very, very accurately because they're trying to synchronize with satellites. So yes, absolutely, a GPS would need a very accurate real-time clock. Probably more accurate than your sort of typical wristwatch application, just because of the fractions of the seconds that are involved are you know, important. Any other ideas? Yeah?
Your phone?
Your phone. Yeah, probably.
Kind of like a clock.
Well, the thing is, if it's an internet-connected phone, then you know, it probably is synchronizing with the network, right? So
So would those things even have an internal clock? Like, would a phone or a laptop have an internal clock like this? Or would they kind of just be using, I guess they would have to, right? Or else the time wouldn't survive power cycles if they weren't connected to the internet.
yes, that's, yeah, there we go. So, so I imagine what they're doing then, because that makes sense, is they probably have an RTC chip in there somewhere, which is periodically being updated by internet transaction. But you're absolutely right. If you don't lose the time through power cycle and without internet connection, then there has to be a real-time clock in it. Make sense? Anybody else? Does anybody else have any ideas? Okay, we'll move along then. So the question then becomes, how precisely is time recorded inside of this IC? It turns out we have this standard for time called Unix Epoch time, right? Essentially, what was done way back in the past by the Greybeards is they arbitrarily selected the date January 1st, 1970, right? And they said, this is the beginning of time. Each set, I know, right? But they actually did, though,
Speaking
right?
of computer time.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, how can, okay, philosophically speaking, how can you prove that dates past this point in the past actually exist?
My parents exist.
I mean, how did you know that they weren't created at the moment of this point in time with their age at the time?
Because I don't want to have an existential crisis.
So, anyway, that's, you know, to the side. Yeah, that's a different course. It's fun though, right? So, essentially, January 1st, 1970 is the beginning of time. Every second that has elapsed past that point is one number inside of a big long integer. Ordinarily, 32 bits is used, at least by embedded systems, which means that in the year 2038, the clocks are all going to reset. Everything's going to think that it's in the year like 1907 or something like that. And basically, anybody remember Y2k? Are you guys too young to remember Y2k? Yeah, you guys weren't born yet? Oh my god. All right. So, okay, I have to explain what Y2k was then, if you guys don't know what it is. How many people know what the Y2k bug was? My god, okay. So, in the year 2000, in the year 1999, everybody believed that all computers on the earth would fail at the stroke of midnight as the year turned from 1999 to the year 2000 because of something to do with, you know, arithmetic. They thought that the planes would fall out of the sky because their controllers would all blow up and think that it was, you know, back in the olden times or something. So this turned out to be like largely just like a ridiculous scare thing. It was like a big moral panic oh, look how dependent we are on technology. This is so terrible. The technology is betraying us. All kinds of stuff. Everybody's going to lose all the money in their bank accounts, and it's all digital now, so So that was Y2K. You would actually see like software, like CD-ROM software that you would actually go to a store, purchase a CD-ROM that had software on it, put it into your computer, and then download the software off the CD-ROM onto your computer, and that's how you installed programs back then. You know. Yeah, I remember they had like software jewel cases that had Y2K compatible written right on the CD, and it's ridiculous because it's an operating system problem, right? It's like, of course your software is Y2K compatible, but anyway, it's like you know, it's like low-fat bran flakes sticker, you know, except it was that but for software. So anyway, so that was the year 2000. Nothing happened basically. But this one might actually be a problem. So basically, we've got 18 years, or 16 years, to figure out what to do about the fact that 32-bit implementations of Unix time are going to expire, which includes a lot of embedded systems. We're going to have to figure out what to do about those, or else we actually will run into problems, because the date is going to wrap around due to overflow, and it will think that the time is sometime in the early 20th century. But anyway, in order to convert from the stored value of, or no, this is the other direction. In order to store a date in Unix epoch time, you multiply by the number of, well, you do a lot of multiplication. Do I have to explain this? It's like you can get dates out of that, right? Okay, good. Question?
What about leap years and leap seconds and whatever?
So Unix epoch time does not take into account leap years or leap seconds. It's calculated in the number of days since January 1st, 1970, regardless as to how that breaks into months or even years. So it, like, day is the primary unit. So if you want to extract like what day of the month it is from this, you're going to have to do some calculation. But this is kind of the raw format in which it has been stored, if that makes sense. But yeah, so negative Unix epoch times run backwards to, I think, 1907. Any questions? That's kind of interesting, right? Yep.
Why is it 1907?
Oh, it's just if you like. That's like when you run out of numbers.
I was just wondering because like if the first day is like January 1st, 1970, it just ends up going back, and like when it moves back around, it ends up going before the start of time.
Yeah, because it's in negative numbers, right? So like we have 31 bits to record the time, and 1 bit to indicate the sign. It's actually not done this way because it's like, Have you guys done 2's complement?
A little bit.
A little bit? Okay, it's stored in 2's complement. So essentially, if the first bit is a 1, then it's a negative number, but that, you know, -1 is like 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, you know? But anyway, you'll get wraparound so that the maximum positive number plus 1 is equal to the largest negative number. So if you take the date January 1st, 1970, and subtract from it a number of days equal to 2 to the power of 31, you end up before the First World War. Does that make sense? I'm pretty sure the next slide's got the actual date on it. No, I'm sorry, 1901. Yeah. December 13th, 1901 is where you end up. Yes?
What is the proposed solution to this issue?
Use more bits. Which, you know, realistically only postpones the problem, but, you know, realistically, going from 32 to 64 bits on this, like we could actually calculate it out, right?
That only gives 68 more years, right?
Sorry?
That would give like 68 more years before that's a problem, right? Because it's twice as.
It would give a lot more than 68
Oh no, like
years.
it would,
32.
right, it would, yeah.
Yeah. So, like if we have 2 to the power of, where's the power button? There it is. 2 to the power of 63. That's how many seconds we buy, right? So, if that's the number of seconds, then divide by 60. That's the number of minutes, divide by 60. That's the number of hours, divide by 24. That's the number of days into the future past January 1st, 1970 that we now can record in 64-bit arithmetic, which is like probably longer than the expected age of the planet. Like actually, no, this, okay, so that's days, divide by 250, 200, what?
365.
Yeah, sorry, 365. Sorry, I'm thinking in base 2. So basically we buy, let's see, thousands, millions, billions, 299,203,478,677 years into the future. So I think 64-bit will do. Frankly, adding 2 bits would probably save, like adding 1 more bit to this would save us all the issue of having to deal with it in our lifetimes. So, question?
Why does it use a signed integer instead of an unsigned integer? Because wouldn't that give you 1 more bit?
Because apparently it's ridiculous to not expect to. It's ridiculous to think that you don't have to represent dates before January 1st, 1970, but it is ridiculous to expect to represent dates before December 13th, 1901.
Right, okay. I see.
Any other questions? Cool. Yeah, I don't know. They had, like, okay. So, this decision was made at Bell Labs during the development of the Unix operating system. The Unix operating system was co-developed with C, primarily by a man by the name of Dennis Ritchie, and a few others. Does anybody else know who the Bell Labs team guys were? I can only remember Ritchie's name. No? Okay. So anyway, this is what happened from the years 1968 to 1972, approximately speaking. Before this period, pretty much all programming that went on was either in assembly or compiled languages, where languages were compiled for specific processors or specific computers. This was before a program which was written for a computer could be transferred to a second computer. You had to re-implement the program in order to get it to run on a second type of computer, right? What the Bell Labs team did was they wrote a universal operating system, which borrowed ideas from previous operating system attempts, but essentially they wrote Unix in assembly. They then wrote C as a language for Unix, and they liked C so much that they went back and they redid a Unix in C, because C was so much easier to work with. And it's not like C came out of nothing. Like, there were other languages which had like similar things to C. C borrowed from a lot of different sources. But essentially, what they managed to achieve at Bell Labs was they managed to achieve, basically, if you could get a C compiler to work on another computer, you could install Linux on it, or Unix on it, right? And that meant that Unix became a universal operating system for anything that you could get a C compiler on. And like they worked like mad to get C compilers out to as many different, computer types of computers as they could. Unix was actually distributed initially for free to schools, and thus came to dominate the entire world because anybody who learned an operating system in school was learning Unix. So they all expected Unix. And then, of course, frigging Bell Labs, I think, was sold to friggin', I don't know, I forget. It wasn't Sun Microsystems. It was somebody else. I forget. Anyway, once they realized that Unix, hey, this Unix thing, this is actually pretty popular, they tried clamping down on the licensing and started charging for it, right? That led to the open source movement. So after that, you get open source operating systems which are roughly Unix-based, like OpenBSD. By the time you hit the 90s, Linus Torvalds is hacking together the Linux kernel, and now Linux is the dominant operating system on the planet because of its portability to embedded systems specifically, and I'm talking about smartphones. Anyway, we're not talking about clocks anymore. Was that interesting, at least?
Topic 4.8.
Sorry?
Topic 4.8.
Topic 4.8, yeah, really. Anyway, so anyway, the year 2038 problem is going to be a problem, and I don't know. This is going to be a bigger problem than the year 2000 bug, because the year 2000 bug was primarily a software problem, but this is actually a hard limit on the size of registers, right? So, like, you can't patch hardware problems away. So this is going to be a problem unless we replace all of the electronics on the planet in the next 16 years. Yes?
So basically, you can only fix this with new devices or with replacing hardware in the devices. Like, a lot of old devices will just stop working. Or not, the clocks will stop working.
The clocks will stop working or become very confused. It's going to depend on like what the clock is being used for, yes?
Have some people already started like implementing these changes, or are they kind of just like putting it off until?
I don't know.
Okay.
You'd have to ask the people who implement such things. My understanding, though, is like anybody who's using 32-bit registers in real-time clocks these days knows they're on borrowed time. So probably people are still using them because they're cheaper than 64-bit, right? And getting the price down is still going to be a consideration. But like. Yeah, anybody who expects their device to last longer than 20 years is definitely. But who expects a hardware device, like from a manufacturer's perspective, who's expecting their device to last 20 years?
So what if they like this might sound like a dumb question, but what if they like reset it and said, okay, on that day, like that's when we start time again, and then they start like going through that? Is that possible?
So you're proposing that we resynchronize all of the clocks in all of the embedded systems across the entire world to one particular second? Right?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But I think your attempts to figure out a solution to the year 2038 problem are laudable. But it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. So anyway. So let's talk about crystal inaccuracy, right? Don't ask me why, but they use parts per million to say how accurate or inaccurate your clock is. Parts per million is a unit that's normally reserved for things like poison. Arsenic is deadly at X number of parts per million, that kind of thing. So I don't know why they're using it here, but essentially this is the number of the parts per million on an oscillator is the number of clock skips you can expect per million clock ticks, essentially. So, yeah, it's essentially your actual frequency, subtract your theoretical frequency, divided by your theoretical frequency, right? So the watch, when you have like a time dedicated device like a watch, the typical parts per million on the oscillators that they use for those is 20. So for every million cycles, you'll have a sort of a plus minus range of 20 on that, right? This equates to approximately 1.7 seconds per day, but the slippage in the crystal has there are more factors than just the physical makeup of the thing. You also, age is also a factor. The older the oscillator is, the more it's going to be off, right? Which is why eventually, it's like, oh man, my digital clock just seems to be off more and more. It's like, well, it's 10 years old, maybe I should get a new one. That's why. So, let me just open my note here. All right. I wrote down the abbreviations, good. So, not only is age a factor, but temperature is also a factor. The warmer or hotter the thing is, the more its clock is going to slip. So actually, and technically speaking, electronics run faster inside of colder environments because they don't lose as many clock cycles. It's not a great effect, but it's still there, which is kind of interesting. So, so inside of the STM boards, you have 4 clock signals that are the 4 main clock signals, right? You've got HSI, MSI, LSI, and LSE. The H stands for high, the M stands for medium, the L stands for low, and I stands for internal, E stands for external. So when I say MSI, it's actually that's multi-speed, not medium speed, internal clock. I think it's effectively medium speed though. High-speed clock is what you generally use for most CPU type applications. You can think of HSI as being the main clock. But essentially, the clocks that are used to drive the CPU and associated functions have fairly high inaccuracy. At 25 degrees Celsius, both HSI and MSI have an accuracy of 1,000 parts per million. That's actually not accurate enough to run a real-time clock. That's why the real-time clock is an external module with its own oscillator and battery. LSE, the low-speed external crystal, first of all, it has a frequency of 32 kilohertz, which is quite slow compared to many of the clock speeds for CPUs these days, but it has a very high accuracy. It doesn't drift very much, which is very important for the real-time clock application. So, there's a trade-off with respect to oscillator crystals. If you have a low-frequency crystal, that means it's going to have a larger physical size, which means it's going to be much more difficult to fit it on a chip, right? In particular, if you're doing super hyper-miniaturized electronics, you'll have to do if you're, doing a lot of different applications require very tightly compact electronics. Say the Fitbit or something. The large physical size of a crystal, which is very accurate and slow, will, in some cases, occupy a significant percentage of the actual board. High-frequency crystals, on the other hand, they have a larger current drain. So the question is, if we want a super accurate clock, why use low speed here instead of high speed? And the answer comes back to power consumption. Remember that this thing is being powered by its own internal battery. The higher the current draw on the oscillator crystal, the less time your battery is going to last. And, you know, you'll run through your battery so quickly that, your copy of Pokemon Gold will only last for a couple of months before the real-time clock functionality blows up, essentially, or runs out. But, yeah, any questions about that? Yes?
Is it assumed that the actual frequency is bigger than the theoretical frequency all the time? Or do you just need the absolute value?
That's it. Okay. Yeah, because like I've been talking about the clock slipping, right? Yeah. I might have to look that up in the textbook. Because in theory, the actual frequency would be always less than the theoretical frequency, because if you're losing waves, right? Then like if you can only lose waves, because that would make sense, because the alternative to only losing waves is to not have a stable clock frequency, right? Like you couldn't imagine the oscillator jamming more oscillations into its own frequency than it would normally have. It can only skip them. So that, yeah, it seems to me that should be the other way around. Good catch. I'll verify that with the textbook, but the textbook might also be wrong. Because I was reading Amazon reviews of the textbook.
Oh no.
Oh yeah. And it's like basically you had like 3 categories of Amazon reviews for the textbook, right? The first was like, very good book, very nice, very, very detailed information. The second was like, contains many technical inaccuracies. The third is, God help you if your professor is using it for your course. So, you know.
What percentage were these 3 groups, like of the makeup? Was it mostly the last group?
No, I would say that it's 50, 30, 20 in order that I presented them.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's decent then.
Yeah. Question?
So, if low speed internal clocks consume less power, or just high speed clocks just more accurate, and that's why they have a use over the low speed ones? Or?
Well, keep in mind that if you're whether you're using HSI, MSI, or LSI, that's controlling how fast your CPU is actually executing things, right? So yeah, it's like, you can think of it as being like a low power mode, you know, or a lower power consumption mode. Because a lot of the drain, a lot of the power consumption in these electronics comes from having to drive new signals and having to oscillate signals and having transition edges and all that kind of stuff. It's like it consumes a lot less power if it's just staying put and doing nothing, right? Though not nothing. It's not consuming no power, but it's consuming a lot less, right? So yeah. Anyway, so right. So I don't think that this is like I'm going to say about this slide, don't memorize it, okay? But we still should present the information on it, all right? So this is how the real-time clock has data flow from the clock signals themselves through to the calendar registers in which the data is actually stored and retrieved, right? So you have the clock signals come in, you have an asynchronous prescaler, which scales that down so that you can extract the subseconds, say milliseconds, right? So you have a register for the milliseconds, right? you have a register for like the regular time, which is hours, minutes, and seconds. And then you also have a date register, which keeps track of what day you're on and, you know, what month you're on and all that kind of stuff. So we're sort of decoupling ourselves now from the idea of Unix epoch time into the the real time as readable. So you don't have to perform the calculations to extract the actual date and time from the real-time clock module. It will give you the information that you need in hours and minutes and seconds. That's kind of the whole point, right? So the first prescaler scales the clock signal down to the point where you can extract sub-seconds from it, say milliseconds or microseconds, whichever is your vote in that particular instance. Goes through a second prescaler, and from that you should be extracting a 1 Hertz signal. The 1 Hertz signal, gives you seconds. From seconds, you can derive minutes, hours, days, months, years, millennia, etc. So, you guys have already covered binary coded decimal, but let's just review it in the next 2 minutes, shall we? So, with binary numbers, no space is wasted, right? If you have, and this is slightly easier in hexadecimal. So if you have the hexadecimal number F, right? That's 15. It's using 4 bits. 1, 1, 1, 1, right? In binary coded decimal, we require the number of bits to cap out at whatever the maximum value of an individual digit is, right? So, for example, this would cap out at 9, which is 1001, right? So, if you collect that up, if you duplicate this a couple of times, you can extract just these 4 bits, produce a number for them, from them, run that together with another number, and you can express decimal numbers more directly in hardware, rather than having to back extract them from their binary representation, right? So this is, in fact, the way that the time and date registers store the information inside of the RTC module. So HT stands for hour tens. So because the hours of the day, the tens digit may not exceed 2, we only need 2 bits to represent it. Hours unit means 1, requires 4 bits because it can go anywhere from 0 to 9. Minutes may not exceed 6 in the tens digit, or 5 actually. So you only need, well, it's given it 4 here, but I think that's, no.
You'd only need 3 because 4
You would-
is 1.
Yeah, you would only need 3. But does it look to you like these are not quite aligned? But anyway, so it's giving it 4 anyway, but probably there was enough space, so they were fine. There's 1 bit that indicates AM or PM, and yeah, so that's how the date information is represented inside of the register. Any questions? Yes.
It looks to have enough space to be a 24-hour clock, yet it's still tracking AM and PM. Is that?
Yeah, right. Probably most digital, most alarm clocks have a switch in the back where you can put them in 24-hour or 12-hour mode. probably, this bit might indicate whether or not you need to subtract 12 before displaying.
Okay.
Yes?
So this, I'm guessing like the time register is for the convenience of displaying, whereas like the date register stores like the Unix epoch time?
Yeah. So, well, no, sorry, the date register does this same thing, but with like days and months and years,
Okay.
right? I don't have a slide for it, but that's...
So this isn't Unix epoch time at all?
Unix epoch time is internally how RTCs are storing the date. That then gets like essentially compiled down into this format for reading. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's like you've got like an intermediary layer, right? So you've got like a clock signal coming in. That's incrementing Unix epoch time, which is then, you know, having lots of combinational circuitry that's populating all of these registers with like HT and HU, etc. Make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Alright, this is just so that I can get down my notes. Did you, at the beginning of the lecture, when you were talking about like missing time, was it clock slip or clock drift?
Essentially the same thing. Oscillator slippage causes time drift.
Okay.
Make sense? Any other questions? All right. Good luck on the rest of your midterms before tomorrow, if you have any. And we'll see you later.